So at first glance, the war between the United States, Israel, and Iran obviously appears overwhelmingly one-sided. America is the most powerful military in the world. It is, in many ways, the most powerful economy. Israel, a military might in its own way, an intelligence leader. It has achieved air supremacy over Iran, whose air defenses have largely been degraded or destroyed. Its leadership has been continuously targeted, and its military infrastructure is being hit also. But from a purely military perspective, of course, you may think the outcome appears obvious. Though wars, as we know from America's escapades into the Middle East over the past 20-25 years, are rarely decided by military balance alone. And the longer that this conflict continues, the more one specific uncomfortable reality, to me, is beginning to emerge. Iran does not need to win this war outright. It can't. But it simply needs to outlast it and engage the United States through asymmetrical warfare. Because the real vulnerability in this conflict may not lie in, of course, stockpiles, sustainability, or replenishment, although I've made a video specifically on that you should look at, but in the political and strategic contradictions inside the coalition fighting it on the other side. So in this video, I wanted to examine three things. Firstly, why the United States and Israel may have long considered removing Iran's supreme leader as a strategic objective. But second, why the timing of this war suggests the operational level of itself may have been launched more impulsively than meticulously planned. And third, why Iran's strategy increasingly appears focused not on defeating the United States militarily, but waiting it out, exploiting and emphasizing the pressure points that could make the war politically and strategically unsustainable.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel where, if you're new, we look at geopolitics, international relations, and economics. I have a proper microphone this time, so hopefully the audio is good. And while we focus on many aspects of the war in Ukraine, right now the focus is continuing on the Middle East, given the severity. And you can find a few videos I've covered from the Russian perspective, China's military stockpiles, and well, in this one, a bit more of an opinion-based video, a bit more of some reflections I've been thinking after 1 week of the escalations and conflict we've been seeing across the Middle East. Now, before getting started, I of course want to hear what you think. Do you think that the biggest element of all of this is the political capital that Trump has, that Iran simply just has to outlast, asymmetrically undermine the Americans in different theaters at different pressure points, was known through Napoleon's theories and emphasis, decisive points, putting pressure on those decisive points? Let me know in the comments below. So firstly, in the run-up to February 28th and initiation of Operation Epic Fury, there were different considerations of what exactly the military objectives, the strategic objectives were of the United States, of Israel. Because whilst these two countries do obviously have overlapping and very similar intentions, interests over the Middle East, they're not exactly the same. And we've seen in previous years, or at least in previous administrations, when the Israeli government is perhaps more willing to go to extreme lengths than the Americans. Now, that comes to one particular central aspect of this, which is that the removal of the supreme leader of Iran was always part of a broader strategic ambition. Some suggestions that Israeli intelligence had already identified potential successors to Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Several of those individuals were then targeted early in the conflict. That suggests something deeper than simply degrading military capabilities, although that's what some people thought was the most likely scenario, including me, that if there were to be military action, it would be relatively limited in scope and not actually about removing the head of the snake, as some people use as a metaphor. So it suggests an attempt to destabilize the leadership structure of the Islamic Republic. Yet, conversely and publicly, the United States has been much more cautious about admitting any such objective. Now, I'll come back to more of this in a moment. And this is where the timeline becomes important, because while the strategic ambition for the idea of ousting, toppling, removing the Islamic Republic and the regime has existed for years, the decision to begin that operation appears far less deliberate. Now, to me, The strikes that initiated all of this, beginning early in the Saturday morning of February 28th, after months of these stalled negotiations, well, I think it was the frustration by the lack of progress triggered Trump to abruptly shift course. In the hours following the first strikes, that rhetoric escalated incredibly quickly. Trump just bluntly spoke about all-out regime change, not leadership change, not a minor shift, a significant seismic shift, an entire upheaval of the entire system. Statements suggest that the war could fundamentally reshape Iran's political system, but that messaging created a major strategic problem, because once you declare regime change as the objective, you inherit a very difficult question. What exactly counts as success? How far do you have to go to eradicating the senior parts of the regime before you feel that you've done an adequate job? And so, to me, especially over the subsequent days, from Tuesday, Wednesday, and to yesterday, Trump and the administration began to subtly adjust their language. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth offered one of the clearest examples when he said, quote, "This is not a so-called regime change, but the regime certainly did change." So, called regime change sounds somewhat like a bit of a walkback or a clarification of language. Trump himself, just yesterday, used the phrase of regime modification, which is something I've never heard before, and suggests that he would be even open to the idea of some clerics of this senior sort of positions or parts of the regime still having the ability to govern Iran, it not being a completely technocratic or restrained or policy-minded group of people. Whilst not getting too carried away, of course, Trump can also say, like he did, the unconditional surrender. So he says statements of varying degrees, but we have to look at what the policy is doing, what the action is. And so far, it doesn't demonstrate coherency. These statements point to the deeper reality that perhaps Washington is appearing to redefine its war aims as the war continues. So that leads us to the central strategic dilemma, that if the objective is not to fully remove the regime, how much of it must be destroyed before the war can be declared successful? Is dismantling the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, enough? Is eliminating Iran's entire missile program sufficient? And it's not even about the missiles, it's about the launchers, the production facilities. Or does victory require this deeper transformation of the ideological system that underpins the entire system? Because, as we say, you can get rid of so many people, but if there are still crux of people that have this ideological outlook, then your job is not finished. That's the problem with ISIS. They still exist in cells and pockets, and they still hold the same ideology of the caliphate from 10 years ago. So the difficulty is that these outcomes, they are extremely hard to quantify and, as history shows, impossible to achieve through air power alone. Indeed, no regime has been successfully toppled through only aerial engagements. History repeatedly demonstrates this. Air campaigns can destroy infrastructure, degrade military capability, and apply enormous pressure, but they rarely produce the intended or desired effect. The United States bombed Iraq extensively throughout the 90s without removing Saddam Hussein. NATO air power in Libya in 2011 succeeded only because there was a domestic uprising already underway. Even Israel's long campaign in Gaza demonstrates the limits of aerial warfare when there is no decisive collapse on the ground. They had to go in with the IDF. So in Iran today, a country that is much bigger than all of those, much more complicated, much more complex, that collapse has and remains to be seen about materializing. So then this brings us all to the other element, of course, which has been emerging in the past couple of days. The idea of the Kurds and paramilitary groups in the northwest, parts of the country, separatist entities, perhaps taking up arms and instigating a common uprising on the ground with the broader Iranian population. Now, that strategy faces, I think it should be pretty clear, enormous obstacles. The Kurd population inside Iran is relatively small compared to the wider population or the Kurds in other countries like Turkey or Iraq. Even if Kurdish groups were armed, they would still face a powerful and deeply entrenched security apparatus consisting not just of the IRGC, but the Basij militia and the Artesh, or the irregular Iranian army, which a lot of people forget. Together, these forces form one of the most ideologically combined and committed security systems in the world, let alone the region, and numbers in the upwards of 300,000 to 500,000 in some estimates. And no matter how well trained or backed the Kurds are, that is a tall order to overcome. Moreover, a heavy militarized Kurdish insurgency would almost certainly trigger reactions from neighboring states, namely Turkey and even Azerbaijan, which is arming in a defensive posture now. Both of these countries view Kurdish militancy as a direct threat to their national interests, and so this could quickly widen the conflict in unpredictable ways. Turkey is a NATO member, and given that the United States is in there, France, Germany, the Dutch, the British, the Greeks are all sending some form of military asset to the Eastern Mediterranean to protect Cyprus as well as other interests, well, then this can quickly be an actual potential involvement of NATO itself. And so this is where Iran's strategy, to flip it on its head, becomes clearer. Tehran understands that it cannot defeat the United States militarily. That is not the objective here. Instead, Iran appears to be applying pressure at these decisive points, where the coalition is most vulnerable. One is US military bases across the region, or more specifically, closer to Iran in the Gulf states, and have proven especially exposed, more than many people expected. Another is the domestic political environment inside, of course, the US, where prolonged conflict can erode support, not that this operation in the first place had anything of that kind. And then, of course, the third is the economic vulnerability of not just the Gulf states, where the oil facilities that the Iranians are targeting very deliberately, but, of course, the overall global economy. Iran understands that modern wars of this kind are battles of stockpiles and choke points. The US and its partners possess vastly superior firepower, but many of the systems being used to defend against Iranian attacks are expensive and produced in limited numbers. Interceptor missiles such as Patriots or other advanced air defense systems can cost millions of dollars per shot and are often fired in pairs to guarantee interception of be them drones or missiles. And if a Shahed drone by the Iranians is 20,000 compared to one interceptor which is 4 million, well, the math isn't nothing, at least in the long term. So Iran does not need to overwhelm those systems entirely. It only needs to use force repeatedly, selectively, reservedly, but drawn out. Every drone, missile, volley aimed at a base or energy facility forces the coalition to expend costly defensive munitions. And over time, that creates a logistical contest where sustaining defensive coverage across multiple countries becomes increasingly difficult. Indeed, the Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most critical areas of all of this. It is one of the most important maritime choke points in the world. A fifth of all global oil supplies pass through it, but not just from Iran, but from Qatar, from Kuwait, from Saudi Arabia, or the Emirates. So limited disruptions there trigger major volatility, and we see that with oil now reaching over $92 a barrel. Iran does not need to close the strait completely. In many ways it can't. But it only needs to create enough uncertainty to pressure global markets and governments dependent on those stable oil flows. And considering the lack of ships that are passing through, it seems to be working. This is particularly sensitive for the Gulf states because these countries depend heavily on stable energy exports, and their defense systems are already being used to intercept these missiles and drones. These systems rely on the interceptor stockpiles that are finite, and some people believe that they could be depleted even more quickly than expected if the conflict continues at this rate and intensity. The longer the war drags on, the more nervous Gulf governments become about the sustainability of their own defenses and the security of their economic lifelines. So to me, simply, this explains why Iran appears to be pacing itself and its use of its munitions stockpiles. Instead of exhausting them early, Tehran seems focused on preserving the ability to apply pressure over time, even if it's in a minimal amount. If you can psychologically undermine your enemy in confidence and build political disruption across different countries, then that is enough. By launching smaller but regular waves of attacks, Iran forces the coalition to maintain some kind of constant state of defense, alertness, and therefore fatigue. Every additional week increases the political, economic, and military pressure on the coalition while allowing Iran to conserve its own capabilities for the most decisive moments. The more protracted a conflict is, the more complicated the geopolitical picture becomes. One immediate effect of this is the strategic distraction. The United States has already had to shift military attention and seemingly a third aircraft carrier towards the Middle East at a time when Washington has repeatedly said its long-term priority is China and the Indo-Pacific. If the conflict persists, it risks drawing additional naval, air defense, and intelligence resources away from Asia. And it seems clear that the Chinese, the Russians, and even North Korea are supporting Iran in some way at them. Simultaneously with Russia, they could take advantage, theoretically, of the distraction by increasing the pressure on Ukraine, testing Europe's limits as well. Even if these powers are not directly, therefore, involved in the conflict, the prolonged instability in the Middle East benefits them by complicating American strategic planning and dividing Western focus, or well, one can argue how much there is united focus now. Overall, my emphasis with this video is that a lot of the focus is on the firepower because it's juicy, it's the tension grabbing, it's where the action is. As we try to do on this channel, we want to be more nuanced and multifaceted, to be comprehensive in understanding what the hell is going on. And in my mind, sure, the Americans would beat the Iranians in a typical battle. If you wanted to do a scenario where you put troops on the ground, you have all the assets and you run some kind of war game, I think it's pretty clear who would win. But in the real world, that's not how it works. Wars are not decided by military capability alone. They are shaped by the political cohesion, the economic endurance, and of course the strategic patience, which is why Russia continues to defy prospects that many people thought it wouldn't when the war first started becoming evident that they weren't doing well. It only needs to make one war costly enough, complex enough, and in this case for Iran, politically difficult enough to see that the Israeli-American coalition questions their own objectives and each other's. So enough doubts, and the war is definitely not inevitable for them to lose. But that's it from me, everyone. Let me know in the comments what you think. If you like the video, then do give it a like, subscribe, and be sure to check out some of the others, including this one about why China isn't panicking over the war as you might think. Take care.